Sarah Martinez had always dreamed of serving her country, but she never imagined it would lead her to this moment. Standing at the edge of a military helicopter, 30,000 feet above the mountains of Afghanistan, she felt her heart racing beneath her tactical vest. The wind whipped through her short black hair as she checked her equipment one final time. The mission was classified, known only to a select few in the intelligence community. Sarah was a communications specialist with the 82nd Airborne Division, but today she carried something far more valuable than standard radio equipment. Strapped to her chest was a small black device that looked innocent enough, but contained critical intelligence that could change the course of the war. Her team leader, Captain James Rodriguez, had briefed her just hours before. The device contained location data for high-value targets that had eluded capture for months. Sarah's job was simple in theory but dangerous in practice. Parachute into enemy territory, reach the extraction point, and transmit the data to headquarters before enemy forces could intercept her. "Martinez, you ready?" shouted Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes over the roar of the helicopter blades. Hayes was a veteran of 3 tours and had personally selected Sarah for this mission. She saw something special in the young soldier, a combination of technical skill and unwavering determination that reminded her of herself 20 years ago. Sarah nodded, adjusting her parachute straps. Below them, the landscape stretched endlessly, a maze of rocky peaks and deep valleys where enemy forces could be hiding anywhere. Intelligence reports suggested the area was heavily patrolled, but this was their only window of opportunity. The pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. 2 minutes to drop zone. "Weather's getting rough down there, but we're still green for the mission." Sarah's mind raced through the mission parameters. She had studied the topographical maps for weeks, memorizing every ridge and valley. The extraction point was a small clearing about 3 miles from the drop zone. She would have to navigate through potentially hostile terrain with nothing but her compass, GPS device, and training. Her fellow soldiers watched her with a mixture of respect and concern. This was a solo mission, which meant no backup if things went wrong. Sarah had volunteered for it specifically because she knew the importance of the intelligence she carried. The device contained real-time locations of terrorist cells that were planning coordinated attacks on civilian targets. "You sure about this, Martinez?" asked Sergeant First Class Michael Chen, her closest friend in the unit. They had trained together for 2 years, and he knew Sarah better than anyone. "This isn't like our usual missions." "You'll be completely on your own out there." Sarah smiled grimly. "Someone has to do it, Chen, and according to command, I'm the best they've got for this kind of operation." She wasn't boasting. It was simply the truth. Her technical skills were unmatched in the division, and her physical fitness scores were in the top 5%. The helicopter shuddered as they hit turbulence. Sarah gripped the safety line, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Hundreds of innocent lives could depend on the success of this mission. The intelligence indicated that the terrorist cells were planning to strike within the next 48 hours. "1 minute," called the pilot. Sarah moved to the open door of the helicopter, looking down at the mountainous terrain below. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valleys. Night would provide cover for her mission, but it would also make navigation more challenging. Captain Rodriguez appeared beside her, his expression serious. "Remember, Martinez, once you're on the ground, maintain radio silence until you reach the extraction point. We can't risk enemy forces triangulating your position. The device you're carrying is encrypted, but we can't take any chances." Sarah checked her watch. In approximately 4 hours, she needed to be at the extraction coordinates ready to transmit the critical data. The timing was crucial because the intelligence would only be actionable for a limited window. Any delay could render the entire mission useless. The helicopter pilot gave the final signal. Sarah took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and stepped into the void. As she fell through the darkening sky, her parachute deploying smoothly above her, she had no idea that this mission would test every limit of her training and courage. The device strapped to her chest contained information that could save countless lives, but getting it to its destination would prove to be more challenging than anyone had anticipated. The landing was rougher than Sarah had anticipated. Her parachute caught on a rocky outcropping, sending her tumbling down a steep slope before she could cut herself free. Pain shot through her left shoulder as she rolled to a stop against a boulder, but she quickly assessed her condition. Nothing appeared to be broken, though her shoulder would definitely slow her down. She gathered her parachute quickly, stuffing it into a crevice between rocks where it would be difficult to spot from above. The device was still secure against her chest, its status light glowing a reassuring green. Sarah checked her GPS coordinates and realized the rough landing had taken her about half a mile off course, but she was still within the mission parameters. The mountain air was thin and cold, making each breath feel insufficient. Sarah adjusted her night vision goggles and began moving toward the extraction point. The terrain was more challenging than the satellite images had suggested, with loose rocks that threatened to give way under her boots and steep drops that appeared suddenly in the darkness. After an hour of careful navigation, Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of vehicles in the distance. She dropped to the ground immediately, using her night vision to scan the area below. 3 military trucks were moving along a mountain road she hadn't known existed, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Her heart sank as she realized these were enemy patrol vehicles, and they appeared to be conducting a systematic search of the area. Someone had either detected the helicopter's approach or discovered her parachute, despite her efforts to hide it. Either way, her mission had just become significantly more dangerous. Sarah pressed herself against the rocky ground, watching as the vehicles stopped and armed soldiers began deploying from the trucks. Through her night vision, she could count at least 12 men, all carrying automatic weapons and what appeared to be tracking equipment. They were definitely searching for her. The communications device pressed against her chest seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. The intelligence it contained included details about a planned attack on a school in Kabul, scheduled for the following afternoon. Hundreds of children would be at risk if she failed to transmit the data in time. Moving carefully from rock to rock, Sarah tried to circle around the search area. The enemy soldiers were professional and methodical, using handheld devices that she suspected were heat sensors. Staying hidden would require all of her training and a considerable amount of luck. As she crawled through a narrow gap between 2 large boulders, Sarah's equipment belt caught on a sharp edge. The metallic scraping sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet mountain air. She froze, holding her breath as she listened for any indication that the noise had been detected. Footsteps approached her position. Through a crack in the rocks, Sarah could see an enemy soldier moving directly toward her hiding spot, his weapon raised and ready. The man was young, probably no older than she was, but his movements were confident and experienced. He was clearly a trained soldier, not a militia member. Sarah's hand moved slowly to the knife on her belt. She had trained in hand-to-hand combat, but she had never killed anyone before. The thought of taking a life, even an enemy's life, made her stomach clench with anxiety. But the mission was too important to fail because of her personal feelings. The soldier stopped just inches from her hiding place. Sarah could hear his breathing, could smell the cigarette smoke on his clothes. He spoke quietly into a radio, reporting his position to his team leader. Sarah didn't understand the language, but his tone suggested he had found something suspicious. Suddenly, a noise from the opposite direction caught the soldier's attention. One of his teammates was calling out, having apparently discovered something more interesting than the rocks where Sarah was hiding. The soldier near her position turned and jogged away, leaving Sarah alone and shaking with relief. She waited another 10 minutes before moving again, using the time to study the patrol patterns of the enemy team. They were moving in a grid search, checking every possible hiding place with military precision. Getting past them would require perfect timing and a route that took her well outside the normal paths through the mountains. Sarah consulted her map again, looking for alternative routes to the extraction point. There was a narrow canyon about 2 miles to the east that would add time to her journey, but might allow her to avoid the search teams entirely. The risk was that the canyon was unmarked on her map, which meant she would be navigating blind through potentially dangerous terrain. The decision was made for her when she spotted additional vehicle lights approaching from the south. The enemy was reinforcing their search, bringing in more personnel and equipment. Sarah's window of opportunity was closing rapidly, and she needed to move now if she had any hope of completing the mission. She began working her way toward the canyon, moving slowly and carefully through the darkness. Every shadow could hide an enemy soldier. Every sound could signal the end of her mission. The device against her chest felt like it was burning through her tactical vest, a constant reminder of the lives that depended on her success. The canyon entrance was darker than Sarah had expected, with walls that rose nearly vertical on both sides. Her night vision goggles could barely penetrate the shadows, and she had to rely heavily on her other senses to navigate the narrow passage. The sound of her footsteps echoed off the rock walls, making her wince with each step. She had been moving through the canyon for nearly an hour when she heard the sound that made her blood run cold. Helicopters. The distinct whoop-whoop-whoop of rotor blades echoed through the canyon, multiplied and distorted by the rocky walls until it seemed like the sound was coming from everywhere at once. Sarah pressed herself against the canyon wall, looking up at the narrow strip of sky visible between the towering rocks. 2 helicopters passed overhead, their searchlights probing the darkness below. She realized with growing dread that the enemy had brought in air support, which meant her position in the canyon might actually be a trap rather than an escape route. The canyon floor was covered with loose stones and debris, making silent movement nearly impossible. Sarah tried to time her steps with the helicopter passes, using the noise of the rotors to mask the sound of her footfalls. But as she rounded a bend in the canyon, she discovered something that changed everything. Ahead of her, the canyon split into 3 separate passages. Her map showed none of these passages, which meant she was now in completely uncharted territory. Worse yet, she could see the glow of flashlights coming from one of the passages, indicating that enemy soldiers had entered the canyon system from another direction. Sarah checked her watch and felt her stomach drop. She had less than 2 hours to reach the extraction point, and she was now lost in a maze of canyons with enemy forces closing in from multiple directions. The mission that had seemed challenging but achievable was now looking nearly impossible. She chose the middle passage, reasoning that it seemed to head in the general direction of her destination. But after 30 minutes of careful movement, she found herself facing a dead end. The canyon wall rose straight up for what looked like hundreds of feet, with no visible way to climb out. Behind her, the sound of voices was getting closer. The enemy soldiers were systematically searching each passage, and they would reach her position within minutes. Sarah looked around desperately for any kind of hiding place, but the canyon walls were smooth and offered no cover. Then she noticed something that gave her a glimmer of hope. High up on the canyon wall, almost invisible in the darkness, was a narrow ledge that ran along the rock face. It was barely wide enough for a person to walk on, and reaching it would require a dangerous climb up the sheer rock face. Sarah had done some rock climbing during her training, but never anything this difficult or dangerous. One slip would mean a fatal fall to the canyon floor, and the rock looked unstable in several places. But with enemy soldiers approaching and no other options available, she had no choice. She began climbing, using her fingers to find tiny cracks and projections in the rock face. Her injured shoulder screamed in protest with each movement, but she forced herself to continue. Below her, the glow of flashlights was getting brighter as the soldiers entered her section of the canyon. Halfway up the wall, Sarah's hand slipped on a loose piece of rock. For a terrifying moment, she hung by one hand, her feet scrambling for purchase on the smooth stone. The communications device bounced against her chest, reminding her of what was at stake. With enormous effort, she managed to find another handhold and continue climbing. The ledge was even narrower than it had appeared from below. Sarah had to press her back against the canyon wall and move sideways, inching along the ledge one careful step at a time. Below her, she could hear the enemy soldiers entering the dead-end passage, their voices echoing off the walls. One of the soldiers shone his flashlight upward, and Sarah froze, hoping the darkness would hide her position on the ledge. The beam of light passed just inches below her feet, but the soldier didn't think to look higher up the wall. After a few minutes of searching the canyon floor, the team moved on to check other passages. Sarah continued along the ledge, which gradually curved around the canyon wall, and began to descend toward another passage. Her legs were shaking from the effort of maintaining her balance, and her injured shoulder was making it difficult to maintain her grip on the rock face. As she reached the end of the ledge, Sarah could see that this new passage appeared to lead in the right direction, but she could also see something else that filled her with dread. More flashlights moving through the darkness ahead of her. The enemy had anticipated that someone might try to use the canyon system to avoid their patrols, and they had positioned teams throughout the entire area. Sarah realized that she was completely surrounded. Enemy forces were behind her, ahead of her and above her in the helicopters. The mission that had started as a straightforward intelligence drop had become a desperate fight for survival. And with each passing minute, the window for transmitting the critical data was getting smaller. She checked the device one more time, confirming that it was still functioning properly. The status light continued to glow green, indicating that the intelligence was intact and ready for transmission. All she had to do was reach the extraction point and survive long enough to send the data. But with enemy forces closing in from all directions, that was beginning to seem like an impossible task. As Sarah crouched in the shadows of the narrow canyon passage, listening to the enemy soldiers search the area around her, she noticed something that hadn't been visible before. A small opening in the canyon wall, partially hidden by fallen rocks, seemed to lead into some kind of cave system. The opening was barely large enough for a person to crawl through, but it might offer a way out of the canyon without being detected. Sarah examined the opening more carefully with her night vision goggles. Cool air was flowing out of the cave, which suggested it connected to the outside somewhere. Cave systems in this region were known to be extensive, carved out over thousands of years by underground streams. If she could navigate through the caves, she might be able to emerge much closer to the extraction point. The decision to enter the cave was not made lightly. Cave systems could be dangerous with unstable ceilings, sudden drops, and the possibility of getting lost in a maze of tunnels. But with enemy forces systematically searching the canyons above, the underground route might be her only chance to complete the mission. Sarah squeezed through the narrow opening, pulling herself into the cave on her hands and knees. The space opened up quickly, allowing her to stand upright in what appeared to be a natural tunnel carved through the rock. The walls were smooth, polished by centuries of water flow, and the floor was covered with a thin layer of sand and small stones. Moving through the cave was slower than Sarah had hoped. Her night vision goggles helped, but they had limited range in the complete darkness of the underground tunnel. She had to test each step carefully, probing ahead with her hands to avoid sudden drops or obstacles. The communications device pressed against her chest as she crawled through narrower sections, a constant reminder of the mission's importance. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Sarah came to a junction where the tunnel split into 3 different passages. She had no way of knowing which direction would lead her toward the surface, let alone toward the extraction point. The wrong choice could lead her deeper underground or into a dead end that would trap her permanently. Sarah tried to feel for air currents that might indicate which passage led to the outside, but the air in all 3 tunnels felt still and stagnant. She consulted her compass, but the metal in the surrounding rock was affecting the needle, making it spin erratically. Her GPS device showed no signal, which was expected underground but still concerning. She chose the middle passage, hoping it would continue in the general direction she needed to travel. This tunnel was wider than the first, with a higher ceiling that allowed her to move more quickly. But after another 20 minutes of walking, she heard something that made her stop in her tracks, voices echoing through the tunnel behind her. Somehow, the enemy soldiers had discovered the cave entrance and were following her through the underground system. Their voices carried clearly through the tunnels, and Sarah could tell they were moving faster than she was, probably using more powerful lighting equipment that allowed them to navigate more efficiently. Sarah began moving as quickly as she dared, but the tunnel floor was uneven and treacherous. In her haste, she stumbled over a pile of loose rocks and fell hard against the tunnel wall. The impact sent a sharp pain through her injured shoulder and created a small avalanche of stones that clattered loudly in the confined space. The voices behind her stopped suddenly, then became more urgent. The enemy soldiers had heard the noise and knew exactly where she was. Sarah could see the glow of their flashlights beginning to reflect off the tunnel walls behind her, growing brighter as they approached her position. Ahead of her, the tunnel began to slope upward, which gave Sarah hope that she might be approaching the surface. But the climb was steep and difficult, especially with her injured shoulder. She had to use both hands to pull herself up over large boulders that had fallen from the tunnel ceiling, and each movement was agony. As she climbed, Sarah began to notice something else, a faint current of fresh air flowing down the tunnel toward her. The outside world was definitely ahead, but she still had no idea how far she would have to climb or whether the tunnel exit would put her in a safe location. The lights behind her were getting closer, and Sarah could now hear individual words being spoken by the pursuing soldiers. They were communicating with their surface teams, coordinating the search to ensure she couldn't escape when she emerged from the cave system. Even if she reached the surface, enemy forces would be waiting for her. Sarah checked her watch and felt a surge of panic. She had less than an hour to reach the extraction point, and she still had no idea where she was in relation to her destination. The mission timeline had been calculated precisely, taking into account the intelligence value of the data and the window of opportunity for acting on the information. Any significant delay would render the entire operation meaningless. The tunnel continued to climb, and Sarah's legs were beginning to shake from the effort. Her water supply was running low, and the combination of physical exertion and stress was taking a toll on her endurance. But the fresh air was getting stronger, which meant the surface couldn't be far away. As she rounded another bend in the tunnel, Sarah saw something that filled her with both hope and terror. A circle of dim light ahead that could only be the tunnel exit, but she could also hear helicopter rotors nearby, which meant the enemy was waiting for her on the surface. The final phase of her mission would require her to emerge from the safety of the underground tunnels directly into the hands of her pursuers. Sarah approached the cave exit with extreme caution, listening carefully to the sounds from outside. The helicopter was hovering somewhere nearby, its rotors creating a constant background noise that would help mask any sounds she might make. But she could also hear voices and the movement of vehicles, indicating that enemy forces had indeed positioned themselves around the cave entrance. She pressed herself against the tunnel wall and peered out through the opening. The cave exit was hidden behind a cluster of large boulders, which provided some concealment but also limited her view of the surrounding area. From what she could see, she was on a hillside about 2 miles from where she estimated the extraction point to be located. The helicopter was circling the area in a search pattern, using a powerful spotlight to illuminate potential hiding places. Sarah could see at least 6 enemy soldiers positioned around the cave entrance, with more scattered across the hillside. They were clearly expecting her to emerge from this location, which meant someone had successfully tracked her movement through the cave system. Sarah consulted her map one more time, trying to determine the best route to the extraction point while avoiding the enemy positions. The direct route would take her straight through the middle of the search area, which would be suicide. But going around the enemy positions would add precious time to her journey, and she was already cutting it dangerously close to the mission deadline. As she studied the terrain, Sarah noticed something that might give her an advantage. About 300 yards to her left, a deep ravine cut across the hillside. If she could reach the ravine without being detected, it might provide concealment for most of the journey to the extraction point. The challenge would be crossing the open ground between her current position and the ravine entrance. Sarah waited for the helicopter to complete another circuit of its search pattern, then slipped out of the cave during the brief moment when the aircraft was facing away from her position. She moved quickly but carefully across the rocky ground, using every available piece of cover to avoid detection. She had covered about half the distance to the ravine when one of the enemy soldiers spotted her movement. A shout went up immediately, followed by the rapid crack of automatic weapons fire. Bullets sparked off the rocks around Sarah as she dove for cover behind a large boulder. The helicopter immediately changed course, its spotlight swinging toward her position. Sarah found herself pinned down by both ground forces and air support, with nowhere to run and limited ammunition for her sidearm. The situation was rapidly becoming hopeless, but the communications device pressed against her chest reminded her that she couldn't give up. Using the boulder for cover, Sarah returned fire at the nearest enemy soldiers. Her training had prepared her for combat situations, but this was the first time she had been in a real firefight. The adrenaline coursing through her system made it difficult to aim accurately, and her injured shoulder made it painful to hold her weapon steady. More enemy soldiers were converging on her position from multiple directions. Sarah could see at least 12 men moving toward her, with more arriving in vehicles every few minutes. She was vastly outnumbered and would soon be completely surrounded. But she also noticed something that gave her a desperate idea. The helicopter was hovering directly over her position, trying to keep her pinned down with its spotlight while the ground forces moved in for capture. But the aircraft was also creating a significant downwash that was stirring up dust and debris across the hillside. If Sarah could time her movement correctly, the dust cloud might provide enough concealment for her to make a break for the ravine. Sarah waited for the right moment, then threw a rock as far as she could in the opposite direction from the ravine. The sound of the rock hitting the ground drew the attention of several enemy soldiers, causing them to shift their position slightly. At the same moment, the helicopter adjusted its position to investigate the noise, creating a massive dust cloud that temporarily obscured the entire area. Sarah sprinted toward the ravine, using the dust and confusion to mask her movement. Bullets whined past her head as enemy soldiers fired blind into the dust cloud, but none found their target. She reached the edge of the ravine and tumbled down the steep slope, landing hard on the rocky bottom but alive and temporarily safe from the gunfire above. The ravine was deeper than she had expected, with walls that rose at least 20 feet on both sides. The bottom was filled with loose rocks and debris, making movement difficult but providing excellent concealment from aircraft. Sarah began moving toward the extraction point, staying low and moving as quickly as the terrain would allow. Behind her, she could hear enemy soldiers shouting orders and moving to new positions. They knew she had escaped into the ravine, and it would only be a matter of time before they found a way down to pursue her. The helicopter was also following her progress, staying directly overhead and occasionally dropping flares to illuminate the ravine bottom. Sarah checked her watch and felt her heart sink. She had less than 20 minutes to reach the extraction point, and she was still more than a mile away. Even without enemy pursuit, covering that distance in the difficult terrain of the ravine would be challenging. With enemy forces actively hunting her, it seemed nearly impossible. But as she rounded a bend in the ravine, Sarah saw something that renewed her hope. Ahead of her, the ravine opened into a wider valley, and in the distance she could see the distinctive rock formation that marked the extraction point. She was closer than she had thought, and if she could maintain her current pace, she might actually make it in time. The communications device had remained secure throughout the chase, its status light still glowing green to indicate that the critical intelligence was intact and ready for transmission. All Sarah had to do was survive the next 20 minutes and reach the extraction point. But with enemy forces closing in from all directions, those might be the longest 20 minutes of her life. The extraction point was now visible in the distance, marked by the distinctive twin rock pillars that Sarah had memorized from countless mission briefings. But the final stretch of terrain between her current position and the transmission site was completely open ground, offering no concealment from the helicopter that continued to circle overhead. Sarah could hear enemy soldiers entering the ravine behind her, their voices echoing off the rocky walls as they coordinated their pursuit. She estimated at least 8 men were following her through the ravine, while more were positioning themselves around the extraction point to cut off her escape. The enemy had clearly studied the mission parameters and knew exactly where she was headed. As she emerged from the ravine into the open valley, Sarah felt completely exposed. The helicopter immediately spotted her movement and began directing ground forces toward her position. Spotlights from the aircraft illuminated the entire area, turning night into harsh, artificial day that eliminated any possibility of stealth. Sarah began running toward the extraction point, pushing her injured body to its absolute limits. Her shoulder screamed in protest with each stride, and her legs felt like they were made of lead after hours of climbing and combat. But the knowledge that hundreds of innocent lives depended on her success drove her forward despite the pain. Bullets began striking the ground around her as enemy soldiers opened fire from multiple positions. Sarah zigzagged across the rocky terrain, using every stone and depression for momentary cover. The extraction point was still more than half a mile away, and at her current pace she would need at least 10 minutes to reach it. Her watch showed 8 minutes until the mission deadline. If she failed to transmit the intelligence data within that window, the information would become useless. The terrorist cells they were tracking would have time to change their plans and disappear, taking with them any chance of preventing the planned attacks. As Sarah ran, she began to notice that the enemy fire was becoming less accurate. The soldiers were having difficulty hitting a moving target in the dark, even with the helicopter's spotlight assistance. This gave her hope that she might actually reach the transmission site alive, but she still had to survive long enough to complete the data transfer. The ground beneath her feet began to change as she approached the extraction point. The rocky terrain gave way to loose sand and gravel that made running more difficult, but also muffled the sound of her footsteps. She could see the transmission antenna that had been pre-positioned at the site, its metal framework gleaming in the helicopter's spotlight. With 300 yards to go, Sarah felt a bullet graze her leg, sending a sharp spike of pain through her calf muscle. She stumbled but managed to keep running, leaving a small trail of blood on the sandy ground. The wound wasn't serious, but it was another reminder of how precarious her situation had become. The helicopter was now hovering directly over the extraction point, its crew probably trying to determine whether Sarah would actually reach the transmission site or be stopped by ground forces first. Enemy soldiers were approaching from 3 different directions, their flashlights creating a web of light beams that gradually closed in on Sarah's position. 200 yards from the antenna, Sarah made a decision that would either save the mission or end her life. Instead of continuing to run directly toward the extraction point, she veered sharply to the left, toward a cluster of large boulders that offered the only substantial cover in the area. The enemy soldiers, expecting her to continue straight, were temporarily confused by the direction change. Sarah reached the boulders just as concentrated gunfire erupted from the positions she had just vacated. The enemy had coordinated their fire to converge on the direct route to the antenna, and if she had continued straight, she would have been cut down by crossfire from multiple directions. From behind the boulders, Sarah could see the transmission antenna clearly. It was only about 50 yards away, but those 50 yards were completely open ground with no cover whatsoever. The enemy soldiers were repositioning themselves to cover all possible approaches to the antenna, and the helicopter was maintaining its position directly overhead. Sarah checked the communications device one more time. The status light was still green, and the internal chronometer showed that she had less than 3 minutes to complete the transmission. The device was designed to upload the intelligence data automatically once she activated the transmission sequence, but she would need to maintain physical contact with the antenna for at least 90 seconds to ensure complete data transfer. Taking a deep breath, Sarah prepared for what would likely be her final sprint. The mission had pushed her beyond every limit of endurance and courage, but she was determined to complete it regardless of the personal cost. The faces of the children who would be attending school in Kabul the next day flashed through her mind, giving her the strength she needed for the final push. Sarah burst from behind the boulders and ran directly toward the antenna, her weapon firing at enemy positions to keep their heads down. The helicopter's spotlight followed her movement, and bullets began striking the ground all around her. She could feel the heat of tracer rounds passing close to her body, but somehow none found their mark. With 20 yards to go, Sarah felt another bullet strike her in the back, punching through her tactical vest and knocking her forward onto her hands and knees. Pain exploded through her chest, and she could taste blood in her mouth, but the antenna was right in front of her, and she crawled the final few feet on pure determination alone. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for the communications device strapped to her chest. Blood was spreading across her tactical vest, and she could feel her strength ebbing away with each labored breath. But the antenna was within reach, and she still had enough time to complete the transmission if she could stay conscious for just a few more minutes. The device connected to the antenna with a satisfying click, and immediately the status light began flashing blue, indicating that the data upload had commenced. Sarah pressed herself against the base of the antenna structure, using it for cover as bullets continued to strike the metal framework around her. Sparks flew from impact points, and the sharp crack of ricochets filled the air. Enemy soldiers were closing in from all directions now, their voices shouting coordinates to each other as they prepared for a final assault on her position. The helicopter had descended to just a few hundred feet above the ground, its rotor wash creating a sandstorm that reduced visibility, but also made accurate shooting more difficult for everyone involved. Sarah watched the device's progress indicator creep slowly upward. 20%, 30%, 40%. The upload was proceeding normally, but at this rate it would take another minute and a half to complete. She didn't know if she could survive that long with enemy forces so close to her position. At 50% completion, she heard boots running across the sandy ground nearby. An enemy soldier appeared around the antenna structure, his weapon raised and ready to fire. Sarah managed to draw her sidearm and fire first, dropping the soldier before he could get off a shot. But the sound of her gunfire revealed her exact position to every other enemy combatant in the area. More soldiers began converging on the antenna from multiple directions. Sarah knew she was about to be overwhelmed, but the device showed 70% completion. She had come too far to give up now, with hundreds of innocent lives hanging in the balance. If she could just hold out for another minute, the mission would be complete. Sarah fired her remaining ammunition at the approaching soldiers, forcing them to take cover and slowing their advance. When her weapon clicked empty, she drew her combat knife, prepared to fight hand-to-hand if necessary to protect the transmission. The device now showed 85% completion. A grenade landed near the antenna base, its metallic clink unmistakable in the chaos of gunfire and helicopter noise. Sarah had perhaps 3 seconds before the explosion would destroy both her and the communications equipment. Without thinking, she threw herself on top of the device, shielding it with her body as the grenade detonated. The explosion lifted Sarah off the ground and slammed her back against the antenna structure. Shrapnel tore through her already damaged tactical vest, and she felt warm blood flowing from multiple wounds. Her vision blurred, and her hearing was reduced to a high-pitched ringing that drowned out all other sounds. But through the haze of pain and disorientation, Sarah could see the device's display still glowing against her chest. The progress indicator showed 95% completion. The explosion had damaged the equipment casing, but hadn't destroyed the internal components. The transmission was still proceeding, just seconds away from completion. Enemy soldiers were moving toward her position, their weapons trained on her motionless form. Sarah tried to raise her hands in surrender, but her arms wouldn't respond to her commands. She could taste blood in her mouth, and each breath was becoming more difficult than the last. But the device continued its vital work, uploading the intelligence that could save countless innocent lives. The progress indicator reached 100%, and the device emitted a soft chime that only Sarah could hear. The transmission was complete. Every piece of critical intelligence about the planned terrorist attacks had been successfully uploaded to military headquarters. The mission that had seemed impossible just hours before had been accomplished against overwhelming odds. Sarah felt a strange sense of peace wash over her as she realized what she had achieved. The school children in Kabul would be safe because of her sacrifice. The terrorist cells would be intercepted before they could carry out their planned attacks. Hundreds of families would never know how close they had come to tragedy, or how one soldier's determination had saved their loved ones. As enemy soldiers reached her position, Sarah managed to speak into her radio microphone with her last breath. Her voice was weak and distorted, but the words were clear enough for her team to understand. Mission complete. The helicopter crew monitoring the radio frequency heard her transmission and immediately relayed the message to headquarters. Within minutes, military units across the region were mobilizing to act on the intelligence Sarah had transmitted. The terrorist cells she had tracked through enemy territory would be captured before dawn, their weapons seized and their plans permanently disrupted. Back at the forward operating base, Captain Rodriguez and Lieutenant Colonel Hayes received confirmation that the intelligence had been successfully transmitted. They had lost contact with Sarah hours earlier and feared the worst, but her final radio message confirmed that she had accomplished the impossible. The mission briefings had estimated only a 30% chance of success, but Sarah had beaten the odds through skill, determination, and ultimate sacrifice. The enemy soldiers who reached Sarah's position found her unconscious but still breathing. The communications device clutched protectively against her chest. They had arrived too late to stop the transmission, but early enough to provide medical assistance that would save her life. What they didn't realize was that their own forces had been compromised by the very intelligence they had failed to prevent from being transmitted. Sarah would spend the next several weeks in a military hospital, recovering from her injuries and being debriefed about the mission. Her actions that night would earn her the highest military decorations for valor and service, but more importantly, they had prevented a terrorist attack that could have claimed hundreds of innocent lives. The intelligence she transmitted led to the arrest of 3 terrorist cells operating in the region, the seizure of significant weapons caches, and the disruption of a coordinated attack plan that had been months in development. The school in Kabul opened normally the next day, its students never knowing how close they had come to tragedy. When Sarah finally returned to active duty months later, she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes the most important missions are the ones where success seems impossible. Her voice saying "mission complete" had become legendary among her unit, a reminder that determination and courage could overcome any obstacle when innocent lives were at stake.